Have you ever wondered why we're so used to changing cars every few years? Or why automakers constantly refresh their models, even though, deep down, they're still the same as they were 5 or 10 years ago? This seemingly irrational cycle is the product of a philosophy, one built on power, expansion, and consumption. A mindset that defined an entire century, and it was born from a single company. For decades, General Motors wasn't just a car manufacturer, it was an empire. An organism with industrial, financial, cultural, and even geopolitical tentacles. Yes, they built cars. But more than anything, they built the idea of what success should look like, of how a family should live, and what society should desire in the modern age. From Hitler to the 2008 financial crash, General Motors stood at the center of some of the most controversial moments in industrial capitalism, shaping the modern world as if it were just another assembly line. But empires that expand without limits eventually get tangled in their own web. This is the story of General Motors and how its tentacles reached almost everything, until the world began to move faster than they could ever predict. At the dawn of the 20th century, the American automotive industry was an unruly explosion. Hundreds of independent brands competed out of workshops, barns, and makeshift factories. It was a time of self-taught engineers, daring mechanics, and entrepreneurs driven more by faith than structure, each with their own vision of the future, yet no common roadmap. Amid that chaotic landscape, one man saw something beyond engines. William Crupo Durant, a wealthy and charismatic carriage salesman from Flint, Michigan. Durant had little interest in engineering or the idea of building a car. What he craved was to build a conglomerate, to unite scattered forces and control the game from above. In 1908, he founded General Motors, and within months, he began acquiring companies, like someone building a house of cards. In just 2 years, GM absorbed more than 30 automotive and parts manufacturers. 4 brands became the foundation of his early empire. Buick, the technical backbone of GM. Oldsmobile, a pioneer in mass production. Cadillac, a symbol of mechanical precision and luxury refinement. And Oakland, which would later become known as Pontiac. Durant wasn't building a factory. He was creating an unprecedented industrial network. But the house of cards was as ambitious as it was fragile. His aggressive style soon began to worry bankers, investors, and eventually his own board. In 1910, pressured by Wall Street-aligned financial institutions, the board of directors expelled Durant from General Motors. The empire he had built turned its back on him. But Durant didn't fold. Instead, he launched a counterattack. In 1911, he convinced a Swiss race car driver and rising celebrity, Louis Chevrolet, to co-found the Chevrolet Motor Company. Within just a few years, Chevrolet grew rapidly, largely thanks to Louis's public image. Durant used that momentum to start buying GM stock from the outside. By 1916, the plan had worked. Using Chevrolet as leverage, Durant regained control of the conglomerate. Back at the helm, he sought strong allies, both to hold his position and to challenge Henry Ford, whose company at the time controlled nearly 50% of the market, thanks to the revolutionary, mass-produced Model T. That support came from a family that would shape GM's destiny for half a century: the DuPonts. Led by Pierre S. Dupont, president of E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Company, the world's largest explosives manufacturer. This powerful dynasty had amassed a colossal fortune during World War I and was now looking to diversify into strategic industries. The DuPonts began buying GM stock at an aggressive pace, and within just 4 years, they had become the company's largest individual shareholders. Durant believed he had found the perfect partner, but the alliance would backfire. His erratic, expansion-obsessed capitalism clashed with Pierre Dupont's structured mindset. Durant spoke of volume and conquest. Dupont spoke of efficiency, rationalization, and control. Once again, Durant spent far beyond his means, and when a recession hit in 1920, the DuPonts made their final move, forcing him to resign, this time for good. But the DuPonts weren't acting alone. Behind them stood another invisible titan, J.P. Morgan and Company. Though J.P. Morgan Jr. never directly owned shares in General Motors, his bank financially backed many of the DuPont's industrial and corporate maneuvers, from stock purchases to the expansion of their chemical and automotive empires. In other words, Morgan's money flowed behind the scenes. General Motors was no longer a personal vision. It had become a cog in the greater machinery of America's industrial elite. After the final ousting of William Crapo Durant, General Motors fell into the hands of Pierre S. DuPont. The industrialist understood that if GM wanted to compete on a massive scale, it wasn't enough to own brands. The chaos had to be brought to order. For 2 years, Pierre took the reins. He restructured the company's finances, cleaned up the balance sheets, and above all, searched for someone who could transform a scattered collection of businesses into a single, efficient system. He found that person in 1923. His name, Alfred Pritchard Sloan High Jr. An electrical engineer, a trained accountant, a meticulous administrator. Sloan lacked Durant's charisma, Louis Chevrolet's mechanical genius, and certainly the wealth of the DuPonts or the Morgans. But none of that mattered. His true power lay in methodology, in numbers, in executive cold-bloodedness, and in a mind that was obsessively, almost clinically devoted to corporate efficiency. According to many experts, he would go on to become one of the greatest business administrators of the 20th century. When Sloan arrived at General Motors, he found a fractured conglomerate. Each division operated almost like an independent workshop, with no shared strategy, no synergy. Like a silent architect, Sloan allowed each brand to maintain a degree of operational autonomy, but aligned them all under one strict, centralized planning system. He also created a market segmentation model that would change the industry forever. The automotive ladder. It was a structure designed to target every consumer income level. Chevrolet for the masses, Pontiac for young professionals, Oldsmobile for the upwardly mobile, Buick for managers and executives, and Cadillac for those at the very top of the pyramid. It was a direct blow to the philosophy of Henry Ford. While Ford Motor Company continued to push a single, standardized utilitarian model for all, General Motors sold something else entirely: social mobility on wheels. But Sloan didn't just sell cars, he sold desire. He introduced a practice that still shapes the market today, updating models every year, not because it was necessary, but to maintain the psychological cycle of consumption. The purpose of automotive fashion is not to replace the old, but to make the old seem obsolete. Alfred P. Sloan. His formula worked, and the results came swiftly. In 1931, General Motors surpassed Ford in sales for the first time. From that point on, GM would dominate the U.S. market for the next 77 years. Sloan made GM synonymous with status, scalability, and constant novelty. It became the blueprint for the modern corporation. Its management structures were taught at top U.S. universities and imitated by giants like IBM, General Electric, DuPont, and Shell. The era of organized corporatism had begun. Throughout the 1930s, General Motors expanded its industrial and economic power with strategic aggression. It was no longer just a car manufacturer. It had become a symbol of American strength. In the United States, GM controlled key suppliers like Delco and had even created its own finance arm, GMAC, designed to promote consumer credit and multiply vehicle sales. But its tentacles reached far beyond the Atlantic. During that decade, GM acquired Opel in Germany and Vauxhall in the United Kingdom. Moves that seemed like simple business expansions until the world went up in flames. When World War II erupted in Europe, General Motors became a geopolitical player without a uniform. It operated in over a dozen countries. It had hundreds of thousands of employees, more productive capacity than many nations. When the United States officially entered the war in December 1941, the government didn't have to build an arsenal from scratch. It simply retooled its corporations. And no Detroit giant adapted faster than General Motors. Just 3 months after Pearl Harbor, GM had already reconfigured its entire industrial system. The transformation was so fast and effective that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt publicly praised it as a model of the arsenal of democracy. General Motors halted all civilian car production and pivoted to war manufacturing. Sherman M4 tanks through its subsidiary Fisher Body. CCKW transport trucks via GMC. Allison aircraft engines used in planes like the P-38 Lightning. Anti-aircraft cannons, light weapons, transmissions, and radar systems. Even key components for the B-24 and B-29 bombers, critical to the Allied air campaign. The numbers were staggering. Over 1 million military units produced. More than 500,000 employees involved in the war effort. Over 20 industrial plants fully dedicated to military production. GM didn't just deliver. It embodied American pragmatism and what it meant to produce on an industrial scale. But this chapter of history isn't all patriotism. There's a darker side, one far less celebrated. Since 1929, General Motors had been the majority shareholder of Opel, Germany's largest automaker. And during the war, Opel became a direct supplier to the Wehrmacht. From building Opel Blitz trucks, essential for Nazi campaigns in Eastern Europe, to producing parts for engines, transmissions, airfield equipment, and tactical transport, Opel became a vital cog in Nazi logistics. And like many other German companies, it relied on forced labor, POWs, and enslaved workers. When the U.S. entered the war, GM publicly claimed it had lost control of Opel and that the Nazi regime had taken over operations. But declassified documents and later testimonies revealed another truth. GM executives were always aware of Opel's wartime activity. While it's true they didn't control daily decisions, they continued to benefit, directly or indirectly, from Opel's assets. And what could be worse than not taking responsibility? Filing for compensation. Yes, according to the Washington Post and The Nation, after the war, General Motors sought compensation from the U.S. government for damages suffered at its Opel plant, caused by Allied bombing. They applied under the Compensation for War Damages program, which provided public funds to U.S. companies with damaged overseas assets. And the most shocking part, The compensation was approved, to the tune of approximately $33 million in that era. In other words, while Opel manufactured for the Nazis, GM was paid for the damage. General Motors never publicly acknowledged responsibility, and this version of history remained buried for decades. By the end of the war, the company emerged with modernized plants, war-borne technologies now applied to consumer goods, and a glowing public image as a builder of the Allied effort, an image that, at least in the West, largely overshadowed its European contradictions. Its wartime transformation was hailed as a model of corporate flexibility and laid the groundwork for the post-war economic boom. General Motors emerged not only intact, but stronger. It wasn't bombed like the European factories, nor marginalized like the fledgling Japanese automakers. GM won before, during, and after the war. By the 1950s, General Motors was the largest corporation in the world. 1 out of every 2 cars sold in the U.S. came from a GM brand. It employed over 600,000 people. And its then CEO, Charles Irwin Wilson, would leave behind a phrase for the history books: "What's good for General Motors is good for the United States." By 1955, General Motors had become the first company in history to sell over 5 million vehicles in a single year. It controlled more than 50% of the U.S. auto market, and its influence wasn't limited to consumption. It was shaping the very fabric of the country. Every GM car came bundled with highways, suburbs, gas stations, and the idea that success had 4 wheels. General Motors was America, and America was GM. But its reach extended far beyond Detroit. Like Standard Oil in an earlier age, General Motors had ceased to be just an automaker. It had become an economic ecosystem. Beyond Opel and Vauxhall, it took control of Holden in Australia and held strategic stakes in Isuzu, Suzuki, Daewoo, and Saab. Later, even Fiat and Subaru. It made appliances with Frigidaire, locomotives with GM Diesel, components with Delco, and defense technology with Hughes Aircraft. It was in American homes, in the skies, and even in missile bases. During the Cold War, according to declassified documents, the U.S. government, through the CYA, used corporate giants like GM as economic ambassadors. Through subsidiaries and dealerships, GM exported ideas of modernity, consumption, and Americanism to key nations across the global South. General Motors wasn't just exporting cars, it was exporting values. And in many corners of the world, a Chevrolet was more persuasive than a flag. By the early 1970s, GM had amassed enormous cash reserves, industrial prestige, and direct access to political power. But it had grown so large that its own institutional arrogance blinded it to what lay ahead. The first blow didn't come from a rival, it came from oil. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo on the U.S. and its allies. The price of crude oil quadrupled, and the age of the V8 engine began to crumble. The massive, glorious, gas-guzzling cars of General Motors no longer fit the new world. Consumers now demanded efficiency, savings, and compact size. GM either couldn't or wouldn't respond in time, and on the horizon, new challengers were approaching. Brands like Toyota, Honda, Datsun, now Nissan, and Mazda began quietly gaining ground. Their cars were lighter, more reliable, and far more efficient. General Motors underestimated the threat, dismissing the Japanese as mere imitators with no real prestige. but consumers thought otherwise. By 1980, Japanese cars had become synonymous with quality and were starting to cut into GM's market share on its own turf. Despite its industrial might, GM couldn't move with agility. Its internal structures were bloated and bureaucratic. It had 8 major brands competing against each other, an inefficient and rigid dealership network, sky-high labor costs due to union contracts with the UAW, and an almost complete dependence on the North American market. Every attempt at reinvention was partial, slow, or misdirected. Cars like the Chevy Citation or the Pontiac Fiero arrived late, poorly designed, or plagued with technical flaws. In 1985, GM launched Saturn, a new division built from scratch to compete with the Japanese. But Saturn was more of an experiment than a solution. Though the project held promise, it was suffocated internally by the very system it aimed to replace. GM couldn't reinvent itself without first dismantling itself. While the competition grew stronger, General Motors remained trapped in its own inertia. It rewarded continuity over innovation. Its chain of command stifled bold decisions, and its executives were more concerned with protecting their salaries than redesigning the future. It had become a factory of bureaucracy. The 1990s became GM's lost decade. The company slipped into survival mode, losing market share year after year. Japanese brands gained prestige. Europe became increasingly difficult. And at home, the reputation of American quality began to crack. In 1992, Jack Smith Jr. was appointed CEO. He became the first to publicly admit the structure had to shrink, but the realization came too late. The company that had defined the 20th century couldn't grasp what the 21st was about to demand. The Colossus was still walking, but the world was already running. At the dawn of the 21st century, General Motors was still the world's largest car manufacturer. But that title was just a mask. Behind it lay crushing debt, exhausted brands, and obsolete structures. In the U.S. alone, GM was operating with 8 active brands: Chevrolet, GMC, Buick, Cadillac, Pontiac, Saturn, Saab, and Hummer. Each had its own factories, production lines, and dealership networks. Each was fighting for the same customer, often against one another. What was once Alfred Sloan's strategic ladder had become a maze of internal cannibalization. Its financial core was also under pressure. Labor costs, pensions, health insurance, all had become unsustainable. The historic labor deals with the UAW, once a symbol of social peace, had turned into a fiscal time bomb. Meanwhile, GM kept losing market share to Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, brands that were faster, leaner, and perceived as higher in quality. Faced with this mounting crisis, GM tried to respond. It launched new models like the Malibu, CTS, and Solstice. It introduced hybrids and promised electrification. It aimed to revitalize Cadillac's luxury appeal, but the problems ran deeper. And then came the perfect storm. When the global financial crisis exploded in 2008, the system collapsed. Credit froze. Auto sales plummeted, and General Motors ran out of breath. Cars weren't selling. Factories kept running, and cash was vanishing. In a single year, losses exceeded $30 billion. Its stock hit all-time lows, and for the first time in its history, bankruptcy was no longer a rumor. It was inevitable. On June 1, 2009, GM officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the fourth largest bankruptcy in U.S. corporate history. The industrial giant, the very symbol of the American century, needed a bailout to survive. The Obama administration orchestrated a historic rescue, a $50 billion package funded by taxpayers to prevent total collapse. The U.S. Treasury took control of 60% of the new General Motors, with a clear mandate: save jobs, modernize the company, and get it back in the game. The media mockingly dubbed it Government Motors. But this wasn't a lifeline, it was a strategic amputation. Pontiac was eliminated. Saturn was shut down. Saab was sold. Hummer was dismantled. More than 12 plants closed. Tens of thousands of workers were laid off. Union contracts were renegotiated. The executive board was overhauled, and the future was redrawn around just 4 core brands: Chevrolet, GMC, Buick, and Cadillac. In 2010, barely a year after its bankruptcy, GM returned to the stock market. Its IPO became one of the largest in U.S. history. The Treasury began selling its stake, and by 2013, the government was no longer a shareholder. General Motors had been reborn, but not as the empire it once was. Now it presented itself as leaner, more cautious, and closely watched. It began its transition to electric mobility, announced the Ultium platform, and launched autonomous driving tests through Cruise. But the world had changed. Tesla was now leading the narrative of the future. China controlled the battery supply chain, and General Motors was still looking for its place. Today, GM is a shadow of its former self, a survivor in a world that no longer runs on carburetors, but on lithium and algorithms. At its peak, it employed over 850,000 people. Today, it employs fewer than 170,000. Its tentacles no longer reach as far. Now, they are shorter, more cautious, more regulated. Because even the greatest automotive empire in history can fall. GM didn't just build cars. It built the very idea of modern corporate power. And like all power that grows without limits, it paid the price for not seeing the edge of the cliff. And what about you? What's your take on the rise and fall of General Motors? Did you know the real power this enigmatic company once held? Let us know in the comments. If this story hooked you, you might want to discover how the iconic British luxury brand Bentley was once acquired by its rival Rolls-Royce. We'll see you in the next episode.